Imagine standing outside on a really cold, moonless night in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, just absolute pitch black darkness.
Right, exactly. Pitch black. And you were holding this kerosene lantern. The glass is all smudged with soot, and it's casting this weak, yellowish circle of light that barely illuminates the tips of your boots.
Yeah, you can't see anything past your own feet.
Nothing. But even though you can't see what's in front of you, you can hear it. You can feel this low, rhythmic vibration coming right up through the soles of your feet. Because you're standing on the banks of a raging, untamed river, and, well, you're shivering in the dark.
And that river is the Columbia River. We are talking about a body of water that carries millions of gallons past a single point every single minute. It's literally the greatest source of kinetic energy on the entire North American continent.
Which is just wild to think about, because that was the reality for thousands of rural families in the early 1930s.
Living right next to it.
Yeah, living right next to this roaring engine of nature, this unimaginable kinetic potential, but they are entirely without electricity.
None at all.
They're reading by the smoky light of that kerosene lantern. They're washing heavy work clothes by hand over a scrubbing board and manually pumping, every single drop of water they need to just survive.
It was brutal, back-breaking labor.
It really was. So today, we're opening a comprehensive dossier to look at how the United States government decided to fix that exact problem. In this deep dive, we are exploring the New Deal's Great Dam Building era on the Columbia River, mainly from 1933 to 1942.
And it is a massive story. We're going to look at how the federal government fundamentally re-engineered a river to lift a massive region out of poverty.
Right.
And we're going to examine the brutal political war that was fought to ensure the resulting power actually belonged to the people rather than private utility monopolies. Plus the staggering technical logistics to build these things, and unfortunately, the permanent devastating cost of this so-called democratic miracle.
Yeah, the cost is something we really have to get into later. So the dossier we're working from, it covers the history, the engineering, the politics, and the cultural impact of two colossal projects, specifically the Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams.
Two absolute behemoths.
Exactly. But to understand the sheer audacity of pouring millions of tons of concrete into a wild river, we really have to start in 1932. Because the thing that jumps out from the source material is that the government didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, let's dam the Columbia.
Right, they didn't just wing it. The blueprint was already sitting right there on a desk.
Yeah, literally gathering dust.
It took the form of something called the 308 reports. So throughout the 1920s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Federal Power Commission had conducted these massive, really exhaustive surveys of the river system.
Like incredibly detailed surveys.
Oh, absolutely. These reports proposed a literal staircase of 10 dams stepping down the Columbia. They mapped the geology, they calculated the flow rates, they knew exactly where every yard of concrete should go. But in 1932, like you said, those reports were just sitting there.
So it's kind of like having the architectural blueprints for a 100-story skyscraper. But the city won't issue you a zoning permit, and the banks flat out refuse to give you a loan.
That is a perfect analogy.
I mean, the engineering puzzle was essentially solved on paper, right? But the economics were completely gridlocked. There was no money and zero political will to actually build the thing.
And to make that transition from paper to poured concrete, it required a catalyst. It really took a national tragedy to shake loose the kind of massive federal mobilization necessary for a project of this scale.
The Great Depression.
Exactly. The Great Depression provided both the profound nationwide desperation and the political justification to undertake something this big. I mean, the nation was in an economic freefall.
Which means we can't just talk about concrete and steel here. The blueprints existed, sure, but to understand the why behind the dams, we have to look at the people standing on those riverbanks in 1933. We really have to look at the workers' viewpoint.
Because the desperation was just crushing.
Crushing. Unemployment was hovering around 25% nationally, and it was even worse in certain regions. You have men who are idle, families who are literally starving, and there is this overwhelming, suffocating sense of hopelessness.
And when the architects of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal looked at the Columbia River, they didn't see a beautiful, untouched ecosystem.
No, not at all.
Their perspective was aggressively utilitarian. They viewed a free-running river as wasted water and unharvested power, just water spilling uselessly into the Pacific Ocean while people suffered.
Wasted water. I mean, that is a very specific, aggressive engineering mindset. It implies that nature is really only valuable if it's being put to work for human beings.
Yeah, That mindset was basically the defining characteristic of the era. But the water was almost a secondary consideration at first. The New Deal viewed the dam project primarily as a massive, unparalleled machine for putting desperate men to work.
Right, a colossal jobs program.
Exactly. It was a mechanism to put tools in hands and paychecks in pockets. They needed to hire thousands of men to clear timber, blast bedrock, mix cement, drive trucks.
Anything to just get people working again. And it wasn't just the local workers in the Pacific Northwest who were desperate, right? The source material highlights another massive crisis happening at the exact same time. The Dust Bowl.
Oh, right, the migration.
Yeah, you have these struggling farm families fleeing drought-stricken states like Oklahoma and Arkansas. They're migrating west, just looking for any kind of salvation.
And this brings in the perspective of a completely different federal agency, the Bureau of Reclamation. Because their vision for the Columbia River wasn't just about stringing up power lines or creating temporary construction jobs.
It was about the land.
Right, it was about water rights and agriculture. The Bureau of Reclamation had this grand dream of pumping water up from the Columbia River to irrigate the arid, high desert of the Columbia Basin.
So they aren't just trying to light up existing towns. They are literally trying to create a new frontier out of thin air.
Essentially, yeah.
They want to take this barren, dry desert where practically nothing grows and use the river's water to turn it into a promised land, like an engineered oasis where destitute families, these refugees from the Dust Bowl, could resettle and actually sustain family farms.
It perfectly encapsulates the New Deal's central conviction. The FDR administration firmly believed that the federal government could, and explicitly should, fundamentally reshape the physical geography of the North American continent for the common good.
Like they believe they could literally engineer a path out of systemic poverty.
Yes, exactly. So we have the vision in place. We have tens of thousands of workers mobilized, totally desperate for a paycheck. But you don't just, back up a cement truck to a raging river and hope for the best.
Right, you need a plan.
The sheer scale of the Columbia River required a massive division of labor. The logistics dictated that they start on the lower portion of the river.
And the lower river is where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took the lead, right?
Correct. Construction on Bonneville Dam, which is situated about 40 miles up the Columbia Gorge from Portland, began in June 1934. And the gorge presents a very specific set of engineering challenges because the river is constricted between these massive basalt cliffs.
So the water is just blasting through.
Oh, it's moving incredibly fast.
So Bonneville was designed to be the workhorse of the lower river. And according to the dossier, it had two primary goals. The first was to generate power for the rapidly growing Portland and Vancouver region, since they were relatively close by.
Right.
But the second goal was navigation. They wanted to deepen the river to turn the lower Columbia into a superhighway for commercial shipping. But that immediately raises a massive physical contradiction.
How so?
Well, if you want a superhighway for ships, how do you navigate them through a massive, solid concrete wall?
Yeah. You have to incorporate a navigation lock into the design of the dam. When Bonneville entered commercial service on June 6, 1938, it actually featured the highest single-lift navigation lock in the entire world at the time.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that, because it sounds like magic. A massive cargo vessel just pulls up to a concrete wall and gets lifted over it. How does a 1930s engineering team accomplish that without burning through all the electricity they're trying to generate in the first place?
Well, that's the brilliance of a lock. It uses gravity and the river's own water pressure to do all the heavy lifting.
Wait, no electricity?
Nope, you don't use giant electric pumps to lift the ship. Instead, the ship sails into a massive concrete chamber, and these heavy steel doors called miter gates close tightly behind it.
Okay, so the ship is sealed in a concrete box.
Exactly. Once it's sealed inside, operators open huge underwater valves, which are called culverts, that connect the lock chamber to the higher reservoir of water held back by the dam.
And water always seeks its own level.
Exactly. So the high water from the reservoir just rushes into the chamber purely through gravity. The hydrostatic pressure forces the water into the lock chamber from the bottom up.
So it's smoothly raising the water level inside the chamber, and the ship just naturally rises with it.
You got it.
Yeah.
And once the water inside the lock is perfectly level with the reservoir on the other side of the dam, the upstream gates open and the ship simply sails out.
That is just incredible.
It really was an absolute marvel of modern engineering. They were moving thousands of tons of cargo using literally nothing but the river's own weight.
Wow. But the locks weren't the only unique design feature at Bonneville. There is another crucial engineering choice made here that we need to pay very close attention to, because it sets up the whole tragedy we will discuss later.
The fish ladders.
Yes, Bonneville Dam was built with fish ladders,
Yeah.
because the Columbia River is famous for its anadromous fish.
Right. Specifically, the millions of salmon and steelhead that migrate from the ocean, swim up the river, and return to the exact freshwater streams where they were born to spawn.
And blocking that migration route would obviously destroy the fish populations. But how do you even design a ladder for a fish? I mean, they didn't exactly have advanced marine biology computer models in 1934.
No, they didn't. They had to rely on close observation and a lot of trial and error engineering. Because Bonneville was the lower river dam, the vertical drop was relatively low.
Relatively.
Yeah, about 60 to 70 feet. So engineers worked alongside biologists to understand the leaping capabilities of the Chinook and coho salmon. They designed this series of stepped concrete pools that bypassed the dam entirely.
Depth pools.
Yeah, and water flowed down these pools at a carefully calculated velocity.
So the fish jumps into the first pool, rests, jumps into the second pool, rests, and slowly climbs the quote-unquote stairs until it's over the dam.
Exactly. And the design had to account for turbulence, resting areas, and the precise flow rate that would attract the salmon to the entrance of the ladder in the first place.
Because salmon follow the strongest current to find their way upstream.
Right.
It's an incredible moment of optimism. It embodies this belief that human engineering could conquer nature, damming this raging, violent river while still accommodating its natural rhythms.
It's very utopian.
It is. The engineers looked at it and thought, hey, we can have our massive hydroelectric power, we could have our navigation locks, and the salmon can just take the stairs.
It is the ultimate expression of that 1930s engineering confidence.
Yeah.
The unshakable belief that with enough concrete, steel, and ingenuity, every single problem has a technical solution.
So Bonneville is conquering the lower river. It's generating power, moving ships, and passing fish. But 150 miles upstream, a completely different agency is attempting something that is almost incomprehensible in its sheer scale.
Oh yeah, a whole different ballgame.
We are moving from the Army Corps of Engineers to the Bureau of Reclamation, and we are moving from Bonneville to Grand Coulee.
Grand Coulee. The first survey stake for Grand Coulee Dam went into the ground on July 16, 1933, and the geography here is vastly different from the gorge.
How so?
The river sits in a deep, ancient trench that was carved by Ice Age floods. To dam it here meant building something of biblical proportions.
The statistics on Grand Coulee just stagger the mind. I was reading the dossier, and when the dam was finally finished in 1942, it stood 550 feet high.
Yeah, it's massive.
To put that in perspective, that is taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It ran nearly a mile across the river. And the volume of material used is almost hard to even visualize.
They used roughly 12 million cubic yards of concrete.
12 million. It's as if the federal government looked at the middle of this raging river and casually decided to build a brand new mountain.
Pretty much.
But pouring 12 million cubic yards of concrete isn't just a matter of mixing sand and water. There's a massive physical problem with pouring that much concrete all at once, isn't there?
A tremendous physical problem, yes. The chemical reaction that occurs when cement mixes with water and hardens is called hydration, and it is an exothermic reaction.
Meaning it generates heat?
It generates a massive amount of heat. If you were to just pour 12 million cubic yards of concrete into a river canyon, the heat trapped deep inside that massive block would take a century to cool down naturally.
A century, and as it cools, it contracts.
Exactly, which means the entire dam would crack into thousands of pieces and catastrophically fail under the pressure of the river.
So how do you cool a man-made mountain while you are literally building it?
The Bureau of Reclamation had to build a massive industrial-scale refrigeration plant right on site.
Wait, really? A refrigeration plant?
Yes. They embedded hundreds of miles of steel pipes directly into the poured concrete blocks. And as the concrete was setting, they pumped millions of gallons of ice-cold river water and later on refrigerated brine through those pipes to artificially extract the chemical heat from the core of the dam.
That is insane.
And then once a section cooled to the correct temperature, they filled the cooling pipes with grout, sealing them forever.
That is just mind-blowing. They didn't just build a wall, they built a thermodynamically controlled monolith.
It became the largest concrete structure in North America and the nation's greatest single source of electric power. There was nothing else like it on the continent.
And because of its sheer scale, it became an intense political spectacle.
Oh, absolutely. President Roosevelt himself was deeply personally invested in this project. He visited the remote, dusty site in August 1934, when it was basically just a blueprint and a raging river.
Right.
Despite his polio, he made the arduous journey to stand there and address a crowd of 20,000 people who had gathered in the Depression-era dust to hear him speak.
Think about the optics of that. You have 20,000 desperate people standing in a barren desert depression looking at an untamed river, and the President of the United States is telling them that a mountain of concrete is about to rise up and give them jobs, irrigation, and power.
And he delivered on that promise. When FDR returned to the site in October 1937, the progress was undeniable. The foundation was set, the river was diverted, and the monolith was rising. He stood before this rising wall of concrete and marveled that it was the largest structure ever undertaken by man in one place.
So they are generating absolutely massive, unprecedented amounts of electricity. The turbines are spinning, the power is flowing. But that immediately raises the most critical, explosive question of this whole endeavor. Generating the power is an engineering problem. But who actually gets to own and sell all that power?
And that transitions us from engineering to bare-knuckle politics. Because if the federal government uses taxpayer money to build a dam and generate massive electricity, but then just hands that electricity over to a private corporate monopoly to distribute, the people who actually need it might never see the benefits.
Right, and this was the political fight that Franklin Roosevelt cared about the most. He had a very specific vision for public power. The dossier notes he championed the idea of public power specifically to defeat private utility monopolies.
Which they referred to at the time as the power trusts.
The power trusts, yeah.
FDR firmly believed these private monopolies had purposefully kept electricity prices artificially high just to pad their profits. Before the New Deal, a few massive holding companies controlled almost the entire electrical grid of the United States.
And their business model completely ignored rural families.
Totally ignored them.
Which honestly makes sense if you look at it strictly through the lens of profit margins. If you are a private company, it is highly profitable to wire up a dense city block in Portland or Seattle. You have hundreds of paying customers packed into a really small area.
The infrastructure cost per person is tiny.
Exactly. But stringing miles and miles of expensive copper wire, setting up hundreds of wooden poles out into the isolated high desert just to reach one single-family farm. The cost per mile ruins the math for a private monopoly. So those farm families were simply left in the dark.
And the government stepped in to fill that void. But as you look at the source material, a fascinating tension arises. If the federal government builds the dams and controls the power, didn't they just become a new monopoly?
Right. Did they just replace a private corporate trust with an untouchable federal bureaucracy?
That is the crucial pivot point. How do they distribute the power without becoming a tyrannical monopoly themselves?
So what did they do?
On August 20th, 1937, FDR signed a law creating the Bonneville Power Administration, or the BPA. The Bonneville Project Act wasn't just a charter for a new federal agency. It contained a radical, legally binding mandate. It required the BPA to give preference and priority to public bodies and cooperatives.
Wait, let's dig into the mechanics of that. If they give preference to public bodies, does that mean a tiny co-op of, say, 50 dirt-poor farmers essentially gets to cut in line ahead of a massive, well-funded private corporation in Seattle when it comes to buying the electricity?
That is precisely how the law functioned.
Yeah.
The federal government couldn't just sell the power to the highest corporate bidder. They were legally obligated to sell it wholesale to municipal utilities, public utility districts, and rural electric cooperatives first.
That's amazing.
Yeah, if a group of citizens banded together, formed a co-op, and took out a federal loan from the Rural Electrification Administration to string their own local wire, the BPA had to sell them the power from the dams.
So the infrastructure was literally handed to the citizens. But how did they manage the pricing? Because the physics of electricity transmission dictate that if you live right next to the dam, there's very little voltage drop or infrastructure cost. But if you live 300 miles away, it costs significantly more to transmit that power.
True, but under the BPA's first administrator, a man named J.D. Ross, who was a legendary champion of public power from Seattle, they implemented something truly revolutionary. They called it the Uniform Postage Stamp Rate.
A postage stamp rate. I love that analogy. It implies that it costs the same to mail a letter across the street as it does to mail it across the entire country.
And the BPA adopted that exact philosophy for electricity. They charged the exact same low price for wholesale electricity everywhere on the regional grid.
Wow.
It did not matter if a public utility district was sitting in the shadow of the dam or hundreds of miles away in a remote mountainous valley. The price was completely standardized.
That philosophy treats electricity not as a commodity to be exploited for varying profit, but as a fundamental right of modern citizenship. Think about what this actually meant on the ground. We started this deep dive talking about that kerosene lantern. Imagine you are a farm family in the late 1930s. The local co-op finally strings the wire down your dirt road. The day your farmhouse gets wired, the transition must have been psychologically staggering.
The contrast between the sheer physical labor of a pre-electric farm and the sudden convenience of modern power is stark. It's night and day.
Literally, you walk into your kitchen, a room that has been dim and smoky your entire life, and for the very first time, you reach out and flick a switch. The kerosene lantern is obsolete. It's replaced by this bright, steady, brilliant glass bulb.
No more soot.
No more soot. You can read a book at night without ruining your eyesight. You can power a radio, suddenly bringing news, President Roosevelt's fireside chats, and music from the outside world directly into a farmhouse that used to be completely isolated.
And beyond the social connection, consider the reduction in brutal physical labor.
Oh, yeah. You plug in a washing machine, and hours of grueling, back-breaking scrubbing over a washboard with lye soap just vanish. You plug in an electric water pump, and you never again have to haul heavy, sloshing buckets of water from a freezing well in the dead of winter.
And all of this is happening at a monthly price that a struggling farm family could actually afford.
Cheap public power wasn't a happy accident or a byproduct of the dams.
Yeah.
The entire multi-million-dollar infrastructure was built specifically to deliver that outcome to that specific family.
Yet building these massive structures, pouring 12 million cubic yards of refrigerated concrete, and establishing this grid was astronomically expensive, and the private utility monopolies did not just surrender.
Oh, I'm sure they didn't.
They were furiously lobbying against the BPA in Congress, trying to paint the dams as a socialist boondoggle that would basically bankrupt the country.
So, to ensure the public and the politicians continue to support this massively expensive public power vision, the BPA realized they had a severe marketing problem. They needed to control the narrative. They needed the public to see these dams not as government overreach, but as their own personal salvation.
And they needed a voice that resonated with the exact people who were benefiting from the dams. The workers, the migrants, the farmers.
Which leads to one of the most fascinating cultural intersections in American history, I think.
Yeah.
In May 1941, the massive federal bureaucracy of the BPA put a wandering, dusty folk singer on the government payroll for roughly a month to write songs for a documentary film.
A very famous folk singer.
That wandering folk singer was Woody Guthrie. And I have to point out the extreme cognitive dissonance here. When you think of Woody Guthrie, you think of a rugged, anti-establishment, union-organizing radical.
Yeah, he famously had the words, "This machine kills fascists," scrawled on his acoustic guitar.
Exactly. He was a champion of strikes and labor protests. It seems incredibly contradictory for a guy like that to take a paycheck from the U.S. Department of the Interior to write PR material for a massive government bureaucracy. It almost sounds like a sellout.
It absolutely sounds like a contradiction on the surface. How does the ultimate outsider become a federally funded propagandist? But when you look at Guthrie's personal history, it makes perfect sense.
Because he was a Dust Bowl refugee.
Yes, from Oklahoma. He had lived through the ecological and economic devastation of the 1930s. He had watched families ruined by drought, choked by dust storms, and ground down by the relentless poverty imposed by banks and monopolies.
He knew what desperation looked like because he had lived it.
So when Woody Guthrie stood on the banks of the Columbia River and looked at Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams, he didn't see a tyrannical bureaucracy. He saw deliverance. He looked at the poured concrete and saw the promise of irrigated land for displaced farmers. He saw honest, well-paying union work for idle hands. He saw the literal light that was going to defeat the darkness of the rural poverty he knew so well.
To Guthrie, the federal government was finally using its massive power to fight for the working man against the corporate monopolies.
Exactly. And the output from this one-month commission is legendary. He drove up and down the river in a beat-up car, talked to the workers, and just cranked out anthems.
The widely cited number in the dossier is 26 songs in about a month's time. We're talking about songs that are woven into the fabric of American folk music today.
Roll on, Columbia.
Roll on, Columbia, Grand Coulee Dam, Pastures of Plenty. He essentially created the soundtrack for poured concrete.
And the impact of those lyrics fundamentally shifted the narrative. He took dry, bureaucratic concepts like hydroelectric engineering, megawatt capacity, federal water rights, and turned them into sweeping symbols of democratic hope.
In Roll on Columbia, he literally sang about turning the darkness to dawn. He made it deeply personal for the listener. He framed these massive cold structures of steel and cement as the biggest thing that working people had ever built.
He gave the citizens a sense of direct ownership over the dams.
They weren't FDR's dams. They weren't the Bureau of Reclamation's dams. They were the people's dams.
But, Woody Guthrie was singing about the hope these dams brought to working families, but the timeline of history was accelerating rapidly. Within months of Guthrie's commission in May 1941, the dams would be called upon to power something much darker and much more urgent than rural farmhouses.
The historical convergence here is chilling. Coulee Dam began generating its first commercial power in 1941, and it was formally accepted as completed in 1942.
Right as the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States headfirst into the Second World War.
Suddenly, this massive, unprecedented output of electricity, which had been designed to light up isolated farms and run washing machines, was urgently channeled into heavy industry.
Because fighting a global two-front war requires an unimaginable amount of material, and making that material requires industrial power.
Specifically, it required aluminum. To build the thousands and thousands of bombers and fighter planes necessary to win the war, the military needed lightweight metal. And the physics of smelting aluminum are deeply, deeply tied to electricity.
Let's look at the mechanism of that, because aluminum isn't just dug out of the ground ready to use.
Right.
Aluminum is extracted from an ore called bauxite, which is refined into a white powder called alumina. But the aluminum atoms are tightly bonded to oxygen atoms. To separate them, you use the Hall-Héroult process, which involves dissolving the alumina in a molten salt bath and passing a massive continuous electrical current through it.
So the electricity literally rips the oxygen away from the aluminum.
Exactly, which means producing aluminum is incredibly energy intensive. It requires so much electricity that aluminum is sometimes referred to as congealed electricity.
Congealed electricity, that's a great phrase.
Before the dams, large-scale aluminum production in the Pacific Northwest was basically impossible. But suddenly, you have Bonneville and Grand Coulee churning out millions of megawatts of cheap, reliable public power.
So massive aluminum smelters spring up overnight in the region. The power flows from the dams to the smelters, the aluminum flows to the Boeing plants in Seattle, and the Boeing plants churn out the B-17 flying fortresses that darken the skies over Europe.
Without the Columbia River dams coming online exactly when they did, the Pacific Northwest could not have supported that level of industrial output.
The dams literally built the industrial capacity that armed the United States. It's wild.
And we really need to take a moment here to genuinely validate this era. When we look back with modern 21st century sensibilities, it is very easy to critique the environmental impact of these massive infrastructure projects.
Very easy.
But we have to steelman the perspective of the people who actually built this and lived through it. We have to acknowledge their reality.
Absolutely. For the people who lived through it, the workers who were literally starving in Hoovervilles before they got a job pouring concrete, the farmers who had broken their backs hauling water by hand, the soldiers who flew the planes built with that hydro-powered aluminum for them, this was a democratic miracle.
They had good, honest, undeniable reasons to cheer. By every single metric they used at the time, it was an unmitigated triumph.
It took a desperately poor region and lifted it up.
It took a barren high desert and promised to irrigate it into fertile farmland.
And electrified the dark.
And it fundamentally helped the Allies defeat global fascism.
It was a masterpiece of human ambition and capability. But, and this is where the dossier takes a sharp turn, it was a triumph by every metric they used. The story changes entirely when we look at the metric they chose to ignore.
Right.
The celebration was deafening, but it masked a devastating silence.
This is where we must face the shadow of Grand Coulee.
Let's bring it back to Bonneville Dam for a second. We discussed how Bonneville, the lower dam built by the Army Corps of Engineers, was built with fish ladders.
Right. The engineers recognized the ancient salmon runs and accommodated them.
Yeah, they observed the biology of the fish and designed stepped pools because the 70-foot height of Bonneville allowed for it.
Now, pivot 150 miles upstream to Grand Coulee. You have 550 feet of sheer refrigerated concrete. Yeah. What happens to the salmon there?
The devastating reality is that Grand Coulee was built with absolutely no fish passage. None.
They just sealed the river. They didn't even attempt a ladder.
Why? I mean, did they just not care?
Well, it wasn't an oversight in the sense of forgetting, and it wasn't outright malice. It was a fatal technical flaw driven entirely by scale. The biology of a migrating salmon has physical limits.
Sure, they can only jump so high or swim so long.
Right, and at 550 feet high, the engineers of the 1930s simply did not know how to build a fish ladder that could successfully lift a fish over a structure that massive.
The pressure differences.
The pressure differences, the sheer length of the climb, the resting pools required, it all just exceeded the physical endurance of the salmon and the technical capability of the engineers.
Because they couldn't engineer a solution, they simply accepted the loss. But the permanent cost of that technical design choice is staggering.
It really is.
That single wall of concrete instantly and permanently blocked over 1,100 miles of the Upper Columbia River and its tributaries, over 1,000 miles of pristine, ancient spawning habitat like rivers in Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia were entirely cut off to migrating salmon and steelhead. Forever.
The ecological devastation was absolute, but the cultural devastation was equally profound. We have to consider what this meant for the Native American tribes of the region, the original inhabitants of the river.
Right, because when Grand Coulee was closed and the massive reservoir behind it, which they named Lake Roosevelt, began to fill, the rising waters slowly drowned a place called Kettle Falls.
And Kettle Falls was one of the most important indigenous fishing and gathering sites in all of North America. For thousands of years, native peoples from the Colville, Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, and other tribes had gathered there.
As the salmon hit the rapids, they would use traditional spears and massive woven quartz baskets to harvest the fish, right?
Exactly. It was the absolute center of their economy, their culture, their diet, and their spirituality.
And the dam drowned it beneath hundreds of feet of water. In 1940, as the waters were rising, the tribes gathered at Kettle Falls for a ceremony of tears to mourn the loss of the falls and the permanent severance of their ancient food source.
It's heartbreaking.
It is this incredibly tragic irony. You read the source dossier and you look at the year 1941, you have the newsreels playing in theaters across the country, showing this gleaming white concrete and celebrating the triumph of man over nature. You have Woody Guthrie churning out 26 songs about democratic hope and honest work.
But amid all that noise, almost no one mentioned the fish. The salmon had no vote in Congress, the tribes were ignored, the ancient ecosystem was simply erased from the ledger.
It was an uncosted externality.
Exactly. The builders of the era were so fiercely focused on the very real, very pressing needs of human survival, jobs, electricity, defeating fascism, that they just wrote off a cost they couldn't calculate.
So what does this all mean for us taking this deep dive today? The journey of the New Deal's dam building era on the Columbia River is a study in massive contradictions.
And massive.
The sheer audacity of the plan is awe-inspiring. The triumph over the private utility monopolies to deliver cheap power to struggling farm families is a genuine political victory.
And the vital, undeniable role that power played in World War II changed the course of history.
The tension of this era is profound, and it is lasting. It is impossible to dismiss these dams as a mistake. The miraculous good they did for human lives, the brutal poverty they alleviated, the war they helped win, that is real. You cannot just call it a failure.
But simultaneously, it is equally impossible to ignore the catastrophic permanent severing of a natural ecosystem and the devastation of ancient native cultures. The miracle and the price exist at the exact same time, embedded in the exact same concrete.
The dam builders believed they were doing a national good, and by the economic and military measures they used, they were. But the ledger was incomplete.
Definitely incomplete.
And that leaves you, listening to this, with a final thought to ponder. We aren't building Grand Coulees today, but we are currently designing the massive, urgent infrastructure projects of our own era. We are desperately trying to build massive green energy grids to fight climate change. We are building sprawling, power-hungry data centers to fuel artificial intelligence.
The scale of our modern ambitions absolutely matches the scale of the 1930s.
So as we push forward with our own technological miracles, what is our generation's Grand Coulee? What is the monumental cost that we are writing off today simply because we lack the technology or the foresight to measure it? A cost that will define the century to come. Think about that the next time you find yourself standing in the dark, listening to the power of a river, wondering what the light will cost.